Before starting this essay, I want to preface everything by saying one thing. I'm a diehard comic book reader, and for a long while have adored films by Marvel and DC alike. And this isn't a hateful or cynical look at the Marvel movie formula, rather simply discussing its issues and my frustrations with it. So what is the Marvel formula? To answer that, I'll have to break things up into small, digestible categories. I think it makes sense to start off with the phase structure. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3.
One eternity later.
Phase 75, 76, 77, you get my point. This structure of phases leaves a lot to be desired. Just because you can answer a film's question in the following installment, that doesn't mean you can ignore them in their current film. And while the obvious intention by Marvel is to keep every story on the same path and timeline, what actually happens is that every film within that phase follows the same pattern. In that same pattern resides the issue, genuine fatigue. In Phase 1 we had these films, origin films, all with one unifying goal to set up the Avengers. Now that wasn't an issue, since we needed to connect with and learn about these characters. The issue arrives when the Avengers concludes and Phase 2 begins. This here is Phase 2, an entire slate that, bar Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man, operates as a way of showing the growing contrivances between certain superheroes. And because every film works with the same themes and ideas, we essentially end up with a cluster of tiring, similar films. Phase 2 exists merely to allow each film to slowly establish the Infinity Stones. Yet, because almost every film is dealing with the Infinity Stone in either nuanced or extremely obvious ways, the actual plot and characters feel subservient to this MacGuffin. And that moves us on to the other issue with the Marvel movie formula, the MacGuffin. To keep things short, a MacGuffin means the following: an object or device in a film or book which serves merely as a trigger for the plot. Now let me list a few things off. The Tesseract, Infinity Stones, the Casket of Ancient Winters, the Ether, these are all objects within the first two phases of the MCU. The issue? They have no mysticism or power to them other than complete and utter destruction of the universe. In the comic books, each Infinity Stone has its own power, almost a distinguishing ability that makes it unique. In the MCU, the stones are objects of pure destruction and nothing else. Once you see the first stone, maybe its destructive power frightens you. The second one, okay. The third, it gets tiring. Oh, and by the way, there's another one in Doctor Strange that feels totally identical to this. These MacGuffins are frustrating because they relinquish a feeling of uniqueness for one of tepidness. We know that the heroes are always going to triumph, but at least make it interesting, you know? Which brings me to another cog of the MCU's formula that simply does not work, the death fake outs. Audiences need to be respected. It's cool when our favourite character comes back to life once, that should be emotional and uplifting. But when Agent Coulson comes back after being stabbed through the heart in the Avengers, or Loki is resurrected not once but twice in the dual Thor films, it's super frustrating. And to add another to the list, how about Nick Fury faking his death in The Winter Soldier, a film largely praised for its espionage style, but also one that fails to deliver on a layered plot due to this fake death. The reason this also frustrates is that if Marvel ever do kill off a major character, who in the audience is actually going to believe that? We'll have to sit through weeks of exclusive news reports of Kevin Feige having to verbally confirm the death of the character. It completely disconnects the audience from the forced emotional core of the film. And as a side note, putting the world at risk in every film has really begun to drain said connection between the audience and plot. This is perpetuated largely by my biggest issue with the MCU's formula, and that's weak villains. Villains feel as though they have been written as cliched evil beings, and instead of having some sort of power over the superhero in question, they also feel as though they are just simply a roadblock. They exist merely to allow the superhero to give the illusion of struggle before ultimately obliterating said villain with ease. This is true of all the one-shot villains such as Malekith, the Yellow Jacket, Ronan the Accuser, Abomination, the list goes on. These villains don't feel threatening in any way. A villain is supposed to feel equal to the hero in some facet of their clash, whether it be strength or intelligence. Sometimes the villain's strength is the hero's weakness, which I feel was done perfectly in Civil War with Zemo. But the villains are roadblocks, we know they're not returning, so the MCU's films often feel lopsided, heavy on the hero, weak on the villain, and obscurity of said villain cannot and should not be used as an excuse. If you can get something like Rocket Raccoon to work on screen, then why can't the same be done for an imposing villain? Now let me ask you all a question. Who are, objectively speaking, the best villains in the MCU? Loki and the Winter Soldier, right? That's because they're billed in several films. It feels, at least to me, as though very little effort is put into a villain unless he somehow ties into every single Marvel film slated to come out. Essentially, stop making villains subplots. Also, you fucking did it again with Dormammu and Caecilius and Doctor Strange. It's outright frustrating that the same audiences are not taken seriously with these products. While that is of course due to the money these films make, I mean, why care about the complaining when people keep buying tickets to see your film? But it's still concerning that most of these films do genuinely feel like wasted potential. The penultimate cog of this somewhat poisonous formula that the MCU enforces is this: forced humour. This isn't the part where I say be dark like DC or any of that garbage. Both of these studios are separate entities and they're free to do as they please, but the Marvel films are constantly destroying their moments by slapping silly humour into the drama. Comic book dialogue has always been quippy, sure, but to use that as an excuse is wrong, because comic book dialogue also knows when to show restraint and allow the moments to be simply that: moments. This is an issue that began after Joss Whedon's The Avengers. It was the superhero film that finally awoke the world to the genre's existence. Whedon's penchant for comedy and meta humor was executed perfectly in this film. It genuinely was, but that shouldn't be an excuse for every single film that followed it to deploy the same style. I mean, look back at Iron Man 1 and 2. Tony Stark was witty and quippy, but it didn't dictate the core tone of the film. But once Iron Man 3 came out, coincidentally after The Avengers, Tony Stark felt completely different, as did the property of Iron Man. The tone became lopsided and the jokes tiresome. It didn't work there, and it didn't work in Captain America Civil War. That Spider-Man entrance was supposed to be the genuine homecoming of the character, yet the shout of "Underoos!" just felt cringy. That's an example of a moment being ruined by humour. It happens again in Civil War with this bit of dialogue.
Pointed south, I can't ignore it. Sometimes I wish I could. Sometimes I want to punch you in your perfect teeth.
Why does this serious political confrontation between two major superheroes have its serious atmosphere quashed by that line? It's totally disconnecting. And don't let fanboys tell you that you're just looking for a dark film whenever you take issues with the misplaced humour in the MCU. It's a legitimate issue and concern because there is a lack of balance. With Guardians of the Galaxy, that's perfect comedy. With The Winter Soldier, that's a perfect film that respects its drama and moments over wasteful humorous dialogue. But those two films are few and far between. These are essentially my issues with the Marvel movie formula. I find the aforementioned cogs of the formula to be frustrating and irritating, but I don't want this to come across as an essay ridden by hate. I actually do like many of the MCU films, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any issues. To ignore them is to accept fanboy status, which quite simply means you're blind to pretty much everything. Respect and adoration should be earned by the MCU, not expected due to nostalgia. I love comic books and most of the superheroes that they have put to the big screen, but the way in which they have done so leaves a lot to be desired. Here's hoping that something changes in the near future.